Now we're ready. Good evening. You can do better.
Good evening.
Welcome to the first event of the Rose O'Neill Literary House Spring 2025 Reading Series. My name is Roy Kesey. I'm the only man you know who wears turtlenecks unironically. Normally I am the associate director here at the Lit House, but this semester I am serving as interim director because our true leader, Dr. James Allen Hall, is on an eminently well-earned sabbatical, writing more of the work that has seen them through to numerous honors and awards, including most recently a second NEA fellowship. For those of you who are unaware of how hard it is to win even one of those, yeah, we like that. I had hold for applause about half a line further down. All of the applicants are highly qualified, and only about 2% of them read the fellowship. James, thank you for everything you've done and continue to do to make the Lit House what it is, and I promise to try not to break anything here so badly that it can't be fixed when you get back. I'll try. I'll try. Tonight it is my absolute honor and delight to introduce R.O. Kwon, an award-winning novelist and editor whose work has meant a great deal to me both personally and professionally. But before we get to her, we have a little bookkeeping to do, and it occurs to me that bookkeeping is kind of a funny word for us to use here at the Lit House. It sounds sort of boring and accountant-y, and it probably involves numbers for all I know. But we keep books here. Right? We celebrate them and we encourage them to last in time, and keeping them close to our hearts and our bodies is something that we're really good at. Anyway, the first facet of the bookkeeping is to thank my current co-conspirators here at the Lit House, our assistant director, Amber Talianisic, our center coordinator, Linda Hamrick, and our master printer, Mike Kaler. With James on sabbatical, they are all doing much more than their job descriptions entail to make sure that our projects stay on track, and I am very grateful. Could we get a round of applause for that? The second facet of bookkeeping is to ask you all to please silence your cell phones right now. And if you want to make your lives better, as you exit the event tonight, find a dirty snowbank and just throw your phone into it and walk away. Light on your feet, right? Let go of that burden of contemporary life. The third facet is our land acknowledgement. The Rose O'Neill Literary House acknowledges this region as the original homelands of the Waikamis, the Choptank, and the Nanticoke tribes. We acknowledge their painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. We honor the indigenous peoples still connected to this land and are committed to making our community a more equitable and inclusive place to gather and learn. The fourth facet is to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are kind of empty gestures unless they are backed up with action. The Lit House will be donating all proceeds from our sales of the beautiful broadside that Amber designed to celebrate the work of our visiting author to support the DEI efforts, which is to say civil rights efforts, of the Nanticoke tribe in Millsboro, Delaware, where the remaining tribal members settled after being forced from this part of the Eastern Shore beginning in 1744. Specifically, our donation will be going to their scholarship fund. They give around $1,000 per student to 4 to 6 college-bound students every year, renewable for 4 years, and we are proud to support them in that effort. The fifth, sure, you could applaud that. The fifth facet, okay, this is where I was going to make a big announcement about how the Lit House was going to leave Twitter, given that it has been overrun by bots and trolls, given that the gestures and rhetoric of this past 9 days has made us feel like remaining there, supporting them in even that minuscule way, made us feel like collaborators. And that's not what we wish to be. So we are leaving. That's what I was going to announce, but social media is not part of my portfolio here, so I don't actually know where we are and aren't. And it turns out that James deleted our Twitter account like 6 months ago. So, thanks, boss. So, the big news is that we continue to not be there. House.bsky.social, and we welcome your continued engagement there. And what do we do if that platform goes bad? We'll leave, and we'll just keep leaving them until we've left them all, right? Until, yeah, we will just keep leaving. We will keep saying, to paraphrase, right, as for us and this lit house, we will not serve that, is what we are saying, and actually said several months ago. Yeah, I kind of look forward to leaving them all and having social media go back to just meaning putting a book in someone's hands and saying, we think this book is beautiful and important and we hope you like it. Speaking of good and important books that we hope you will like, we encourage you to buy a few after the event at the table set up by our newest partner, The Book Plate, an independent bookstore here in Chestertown that many of you already know and love. They will be selling books for us here at these events from now on. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to Tess, who's not here. Thank you, Becca. And with that, I'd like to bring things around to the work of our guest tonight, R.O. Kwon. My first experience of her work was reading her first novel, The Incendiaries, which has been published into, it looks like this, which has been translated into 7 languages, was named the Best Book of the Year by over 40 publications, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Award. It's told chorally, which is a tough thing to pull off, 3 voices, sometimes speaking directly and sometimes narrated, alternating chapters, and it follows well-meaning truth seekers and the violent zealots with whom they become embroiled, in some cases which they become. Listen to this bit. This is about a character who has been released from a North Korean prison camp and forced to walk across a frozen river into China. Behind him, a guard laughed. If they didn't shoot him, they'd watch him plunge through the ice and drown. He tried the next step. Spindrift, lifted, fell, inhale, exhale. His nerves stretched, a net to span the width of ice dividing him from the rest of his life. Filaments glittered, straining with his weight. China stood prismatic on the opposite side. He let out a long breath. His soul was blowing loose, but he inhaled. He pulled it back in. There was no being afraid. He walked on water with each step. Then it cracked. He held still. Try to live. Take a step again. I know that feels like instructions on how to survive the next 4 years, but FYI, the book was published in 2018. And what's crazy is that the character being described in that beautiful passage, marked as it is with Kwon's obsessions with breath and with light, is as close as the novel has to a villain. The book as a whole performs an extraordinary empathy. It makes the actions of all of these characters legible. The book knows the difference between right and wrong, and also how easy it can be to end up on the wrong side of that line. Kwon's second and most recent novel, Exhibit, which looks like that, also speaks to me on many levels and topics, and in many ways, 2 of which I'd like to highlight tonight. The first way is structural. The novel's main plot thread follows a photographer who has survived a crisis of religious faith and is finding meaning and solace and strength and identity in art and in love, among other things. That thread is interwoven with a voice speaking to us directly from Korean mythology, and the interweaving becomes tighter and tighter until by the end the 2 threads are a single rope or braid, and the effect is breathtaking, really. The second way this novel spoke to me is both lyrical and structural. Kwon writes, "In this exile, I'd relied on photos, image. I shot in full-frame digital. I aspired to rich, opulent hues. I required solid detail. But chasing fabled signs of Christ, I shot pale wisps, the objects insipid. Images proved dull, harsh. I had nothing until, in line at a Michigan church, salt ice hissing with pilgrims' steps, plumes rising through vivid lips, I noticed the living bodies. People, not relics, I thought, at which point the images began rioting to life. It's rare for any author to be able to move so seamlessly from one register to another, and even rarer for the register to rise ekphrastically, in exact proportion and pace to the height of the other art form that's being discussed. It is a wildly difficult thing to pull off, and Kwon does so masterfully. Born in Seoul, Korea, Kwon has lived most of her life in the United States. Exhibit, published in the US in May 2024 by Riverhead, and in the UK in July by Little Brown, was recently named a New York Times Editor's Choice. Together with Garth Greenwell, Kwon co-edited Kink, a New York Times notable book and recipient of the inaugural Joy Award. I like that so much. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Time, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, and elsewhere. She has received fellowships and awards from MacDowell, the NEA, there they are again, and Yaddo, and she was the 2024 Stein Visiting Writer at Stanford University. Please help me welcome to Chestertown and to the Lit House podium, R.O. Kwon.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Roy. Thank you so much for bringing me here, and thank you to Lit House, and thank you to Amber, and thank you to James, thank you to Linda, and thank you to the Book Plate. It's such an honor to be here. So I'm going to read from Exhibit, my newest book. This published 8 months and 8 days ago. And as you can tell by the exact register I keep in my head, it's been that long, and it still isn't very. I still don't feel especially relaxed about it. So when the book first came, if you don't know, publishers will send you a copy of the book a few weeks ahead of before it publishes. And my publisher had told me it was coming, and so when boxes arrived from my publisher, Penguin Random House, I knew what it was. And I screamed, and I threw a shawl, possibly this one, it was a big one, over it so that I wouldn't have to look at it. And then the next day, I decided that the shawl wasn't enough, and then so I chucked the boxes into a closet, which is exactly where they stayed until my publisher asked me to post an unboxing video, which I don't know if you've seen these, but they want you to record yourself opening the box and seeing your book for the first time, so that you can be excited on film for everybody to see. So I did that. I opened it. I cried, and then and I sent it to my publisher, and they were like, "Great, that's fantastic. The crying is great. Let's put that up." And then they didn't actually say the crying is great. That's great, but they were pleased. But I immediately taped it back up, chucked it back into the closet, and then kept it there until the book until I started reading from it on publication day. And I still don't really touch this book unless I'm going to read from it. It still feels that hot to me. And there are a number of reasons. So years ago, when I first told my editor about the book that would become Exhibit, I explained that I couldn't say much about it yet, but that it was full of sex. And she said, "Great, perfect. That's all I need to know. That's really all you need to tell people." And we both laughed. But also in a larger sense, Exhibit is an exploration of desire and the ferocious pursuit thereof, including desires having to do with bodies, art, ambition, queer exuberance, religion, origin studies, the generations-old inheritance of violence, and yes, sex. With Exhibit, I was hell-bent on exploring a question I have found fascinating. Why is it that I feel so strongly pushed by the world, and sometimes people I love, to want certain things, and just as strongly pushed to not want other things? So every day in my life, I feel a great deal of pressure to want to be a very good, exemplary daughter of, wife of, mother of, I don't have kids, but still, mother of, sister of, community member of. It's all mediated through that of. And the things I feel pressured not to want, to hide my appetite for, to if possible kill my appetite for, include sex, food, any kind of ambition, certainly artistic ambition. Even a day alone often feels like something that has to be defended. In other words, anything for myself. And it's of the utmost importance to me to be a caring, responsible daughter, to be highly active in my communities. I love my friends, but what is so dangerous, what is so wayward about me ever wanting for myself? And so in Exhibit, I ended up following a couple of women, a photographer and a ballerina who want a great deal, and to see what happens if they're given the space to run at full tilt after what they desire, which very much includes what their bodies desire. So many people, including me, live and have lived believing that our bodies are wrong for hoping and wanting and desiring as we do. What can and often does result is terrible loneliness and lifelong inhibiting shame, and for what? For having desires that can be consensually and joyfully met, but which might exist outside the extremely narrow, often patriarchal, often religiously defined confines of what's considered acceptable. Our bodies aren't wrong. We're not wrong. And feeling pressured or forced to deny and suppress what we want, and therefore to deny and suppress who we fundamentally are, isn't just a lie. It's not just losing the possibility of living as fully as we can. It can also be a first violence against ourselves from which many other kinds of violence can arise. But already as I say this, I hear a boldness in the words that I'm not always capable of sustaining. I worked on this book for 9 years, or 7. It's long enough that I lost count, and I actually tried to look back, and I couldn't figure out when on earth I started it. And so somewhere between 7 and 9 years. Oh, and also the first book I worked on it for 10 years. I like saying that with students, just I feel like it relaxes everybody because everyone's just like, I've only been working on mine for 2. But yeah, it was a 10-year novel and then somewhere between a 7 and 9-year novel. And during that time, including right after the Atlanta spa shootings of 2021, I was also publishing essays about gender, race, queerness, and sex, and about overlapping kinds of oppression and marginalization. As a result, and especially right after those spa shootings, I heard from, I think, thousands of people about their experiences of anti-Asian violence and racism. I published an essay in Vanity Fair a few days after the shootings that ended up resonating with a lot of people, and I spoke on the radio as a result, and a number of podcasts, and then so I ended up hearing from a lot of people. And it was and is a profound honor to be trusted with these griefs. It's also true that increasingly, as I worked on Exhibit, I felt terrified of how I was writing sexuality, and in particular about how some of it could be read as aligning with prevailing ridiculous ideas about Asian women and Asian people who present as women, that we're submissive, hypersexual, delicate, willing to be mistreated. It's there from our earliest existence in the US, codified, for instance, in the 1875 Page Act, which stopped the immigration of Chinese women on the stated pretext that they were immoral. I was, and frequently still am, deeply afraid I might add to this extremely harmful idea about us. But bodies are so wonderfully complicated, and so is desire. Not everything a person wants during sex has to align perfectly with who that person is and wishes to be otherwise. I came to believe, as any number of artists have before me, that naming what I'm afraid of naming is essential to what I feel called to do as a writer, and that knowingly turning away from that naming is also a kind of violence. With Exhibit, as with much of my writing, I wanted to write for a person I used to be, who felt like a candidate for being the loneliest person in the world. I knew I wasn't probably the loneliest person, period, but I thought I had a chance at the claim. I could throw my hat in the ring, at least. And I so badly want her to know she's not alone, which is, of course, in a way, trying to let a part of myself know I'm not alone. I want her to live more joyfully with her desires. In the past, books have saved my life, in part by showing me I'm not as desperately lonely as I thought. In Life magazine in 1963, James Baldwin said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was Dostoevsky and Dickens who taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. And I hope to be able to give some of this fellowship to others." That Baldwin quotation from Life magazine, though, I've turned to it before, quoting from it for the introduction to a book I co-edited with my friend Garth Greenwell titled Kink. I've realized that because I co-edited this book, and it's an anthology of stories featuring sexual kinks, and now because I've published Exhibit as well, people seem to believe that I am especially liberated from shame. And you know, I'm all for liberation. I do and will fight for it. But I'm an immigrant Korean woman. I was raised Catholic. I was so religious, and then I turned evangelical Protestant for a while, largely because it was more fun. Anyone who's done this knows, or was or is part of it, knows that those rallies were really fun. The praise rallies, those were really great Friday nights. Anyway, so I was extremely religious, and I was so religious that night that the shorthand I used to give was that I wanted to be a pastor. But that isn't quite right. That's far too chill for what I wanted. I wanted to be a saint. I wanted to be an isolated mystic in a cave or in the desert, or maybe living on top of a pillar. I wanted to see the face of God and live. I wanted to walk through fire. I wanted to talk to God. I wanted to live on locusts and honey. I'm not like an easygoing person. No one's ever accused me of being laid back. But then I lost that faith, and the career path of sainthood became unavailable as a result. But so this combination of being Korean, I love being Korean so much. It's also true that as a Korean woman, I'm not supposed to give any indication in public that I've ever thought about sex, let alone wanted sex. I'm definitely not supposed to talk about sex. At some point, I realized that I had never in my entire life heard out loud the Korean word for sex. And I was talking about this with Korean friends, and they said, "What on earth is the word for sex?" And we looked it up, and there are words for it in Korean, but none of us had ever heard them before. And then it turns out that the default that people use is instead people just prefer to just call it sex, because they just use the English because it's easier in a foreign language than in our language than in Hangul. As far as anyone knows, all Korean children have been conceived immaculately. And so I'm not free. I feel as though I'm walking around at all times with a sort of triple heap of shame around anything that has to do with my body. But what I have come to realize, I think, is that one doesn't have to be fully liberated to do liberated and liberating things. One doesn't have to feel free to do freeing things. For a long time, almost every day that I worked on this book exhibit, I lied to myself. I said often out loud, "No one is going to see this. No one has to. It's just you here." I was definitely lying to myself because I'd sold it to my editor ahead of time, so contractually I had to give it to her, or I'd have to return money, which I didn't want to do. But the lie really helped. And I've learned, too, to trust in fear as a kind of guidepost. I kept walking toward it by writing about what terrifies me, what I could barely stand to put on a page, making art about what half kills me with shame, the secret things I can hardly tell myself. Or as Lucille Clifton said, this is a little more absolute than what I would say to students, but I found this useful for my own self, and she said, "You cannot play for safety and make art. You have to get past your own fear. It's all right to be afraid, but if you draw back from what frightens you, then you may as well stop writing." See, that's the part where it's too absolute. Keep writing. Because in a way, everything is frightening. Every morning you wake up to the unexpected, to what might kill you, but you have to do it anyway. Once you decide, I will see clearly, I will speak clearly, I will say what I see, then you have to do it all. So, because this book is narrated by a queer Korean woman and artist, and I'm a queer Korean American woman artist, one of my various anxieties about this book all along was that people would interpret this book as being pure autobiography, which is a very understandable impulse to interpret books this way. And of course, all fiction is transmuted through one's body, it's refracted through the prism of one's life. I was telling a friend, though, Rebecca, about this anxiety. I was telling all my close friends, they all heard about it for years. And I said, I am so alarmed by the idea that everyone will think I've had an affair with a queer Korean ballerina. And she said, I want people to think I've had an affair with a beautiful queer Korean ballerina. Who doesn't want people to suspect them of having had an affair with a glamorous Korean ballerina? Literally everyone wants this. So she said if people ask if it was autobiographical, just tell them, no, it's about my friend Rebecca. So, a quick content warning. In the first minute of what I'll read, there's a double suicide that takes place 100 plus years ago and is loosely based on a family story. Please take care of yourself and feel free to skip out for this part. I'll now read from the start of the book. 1. She'd go up the tall pine first. He flung his leg on a bough close behind. She didn't slip. her leaps agile. Hanbok silk, bright, swift, flared with each jump. If cloth tangled with the sprig, he lunged to help. In the fresh light, they kept going as high as possible. His parents, upset, hadn't slept. He'd spoken the past night of his plan to wed a Kiseng. Startled, his parents said he must be joking. No Kiseng, paid to sing, jig, and flirt in public, had the right to wed a Han. Not just a Han, the prized first son, obliged to pass along his line. He'd beg pardon, then forget this whore of a girl. Instead, as I told Lydia, he replied that he loved this Kiseng, she'd be his wife. If you don't stop talking, his father said, I'll kill you. Lips tight, the son left. Night lifted. Oil-polished Hanji doors slid open. A maid wailed. Paired bodies hung from the pine, hanboks rippling. Necks breaking, they died. In my Omma's telling, this old tale proved lasting. Trailing bodies, spoiled lives, and evil I'd also, perhaps, inherit. People said the Kiseng's spirit, abiding, hostile to all Hans, kept us cursed. It might be nothing, but spite held a ghost close to the living. It was best, though, not to talk of this spirit. I ought to tell future offspring, a husband. No one else, darling, Amma said. Just by talking, I'd rustle up the Kiseng's ghost. Still, it might find me this birthright evil. I'd flag it through a wild urge, to risk for a futile single love all the ties I rated high. I had to kill this longing. If I didn't, I'd light my life on fire. I said I'd listen. For a while I did. But that June night in Marin with Lydia, I felt this pledge's hold like hex rope, shred, rip, then fall. Philip, you'll ask how I told this person I had just met what I kept from you. I've tried figuring it out, sifting the burnt pile of all that I ignited. It's true that with Lydia, I let go of rules by which I'd lived. Not long after the night in Marin, she fixed a gouge to my face. It was big. Spit wet, the globe fell out. Lydia, impatient, applied foil tape. It stayed on but left the skin she'd taped shining red. I had a rash, allergic. I told Philip I'd reacted to a lip balm. But if not for the line, I'd have loved this rash. I forgot to be vain. It was put up like a sign, as though I might be hers. And I'm going to skip ahead a couple pages. So Jin, the narrator, she goes to a party with her husband, Philip. And they hear about a ballerina who's going to come, who's already very renowned, and she's injured. So she's been looking for this ballerina and hasn't seen her yet. It was quiet in the Marin house. I got out the gin julep supplies Philip and I had brought. I put ice in a dish rack, glass panels slid wide. You're Lydia, I said. Shining from a dip in the pool, Lydia Marshall. She had long, taut posture, a neck rising tall. Upon its height, she lifted her head like a flag. I knew at first sight who she had to be. I am, she said, turning. It didn't surprise Lydia, being noticed. Irving talked about a dancer named Lydia Jung, I said. I'm Jin. Lydia eyed the julep supplies I'd set out. Not going in the pool? She asked. Maybe later, I said. With a one-sided shrug, she picked up sun lotion. She bent her head, dyed pale. Lydia's crown radiated light. Would Lydia's name be Lydia with a Y or Lydia with an I? Jung might be Korean. I hadn't met a lot of Korean people named Lydia. The last time I was in a pool, I burned, Lydia said. I flaked skin. I had fish scales in my clothing. Can I fix you a drink? I asked. No, thank you, she said. I had nothing else to ask. She applied lotion in thick piles. Lydia had ink, a line of script, coiling up from the striped wrap she'd slung on her hips. It was illegible, veiled in white liquid. I had to figure out what it said. She tipped lotion down the slope of a ridged leg. I rinsed a highball, trying not to watch. Lydia's film of lotion hid while inviting, flashing what it kept back. Injured, Lydia moved as if foreign to pain. I was used to this pool, though, Philip. It was a lifelong allure, the gloss of a bold, strong girl. I hit the ice with a rolling pin to crack it. It was striking, a thrill, Lydia's brio as she applied lotion, not caring if I'd watch. But I thought, studied to learn. Still no pool? Lydia asked. In a minute, I said. I don't believe you, she said. With a laugh, she glided out. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
If you have questions, now is the time to ask them. Would you mind repeating the questions for the recording? Thank you. To give you all a second to think, I'll ask the first question. What's the Joy Award? Like, who's in charge of Joy? The Joy Award that the novel is seeing?
I thought you meant that like in general, like who's in charge of.
If you know the answer to that.
I was thinking I would love to know. Let's see. So, who's in charge of the Joy Award? It's the Margins Collective. So it was a collection of bookstores that gave the book their Joy Award, and we were very honored and thrilled. Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Yeah.
Does she swim?
Oh, the question is, did she swim? No, she. Let's see. Through the course of the book, she never got in the pool. This is a long. With the section I read from the book opens with a long party. People stay for hours and hours, and Lydia and Jin end up talking for hours. And at points, people are stripping and jumping in the pool. Everyone's on drugs. I should know. But yeah, Jin never gets in there. Yeah.
In the first chapter, there's some wonderful descriptions of Lydia as a dancer, and dancing is ephemeral, and at the same time, the narrator is a photographer, and so that's sort of capturing these ephemeral moments. And I loved how you were playing those two off each other, and I was wondering if you might say something about writing as something in that kind of same way, how it captures ephemerality, or how it, or is it ephemeral in its experience?
Oh,
is it like dancing, or is it like photography? I guess I'm curious, or like eating.
That's such a beautiful question. So the question is around, because there's a photographer and a ballerina, and dancing is such an ephemeral art. If you don't know, a lot of dancers, definitely ballet dancers, say that the art form, any recording just dies. That it doesn't really capture what it's like to be there in person. It's an art form that can't be handed down except person to person. The notation systems that exist, not everyone, but people generally find to be extremely dissatisfying. And so there's a line in here that's often said that when a ballerina dies, it's like a library dies, because a whole body of knowledge dies with that ballerina. And then so the question is around the ephemerality of ballet and dance versus photography, which of course creates a sort of static record as it goes. And whether or not an experience of writing versus these arts, and is writing closer to photos or to ballet. So let's see. So on the one hand, right, of course, writing can last in a way that photos can last, and arguably, writing just has a longer history of having lasted. We've got those like thousands of years going for us, and who knows what's going to happen with photos. But I don't know, because on the one hand, writing is right there, right? But then I truly believe, as other people have said about writing, and as other people have said about other art forms, that a reader brings 50% of the book, and so the book is remade every single time, made anew. I'm providing 50% of a book, and the reader makes the other half. And so I feel as though maybe the writing is somewhere in between. I don't know if that answers your question. But also photos, right? Like photos, also the viewer brings a great deal to the photo too. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a hand back there.
Yeah, that's me. I was wondering, since this is your, second or kind of third book, because you said you edited the one. How was the experience of creating and publishing this book different than creating and publishing your debut?
Sure, that's a great question. So the question is, how was the experience of creating and publishing this this second novel versus the first novel? For no good reason, I thought it would be easier, and I say for no good reason because not a single writer friend said it would be easier. I think I just hoped. You just kind of hope that if you're doing something the second time around, the writers in the room are nodding. I hoped it would be easier. It was definitely not easier. It was also, though, it was in a lot of ways, there was a lot more just immediate physical fear around this book. So while I was writing this book, and very often in the course of publicizing it, it's finally started getting a little better, knock on wood, but I'm not free of it. I had what amounted to at times hours-long panic attacks while I was working on this, and for anyone who hasn't experienced panic attacks or doesn't know people who have them, what happens during a panic attack is that your body gets convinced that you're dying, and you can't, and it's very difficult to argue yourself out of it. And mine would last for hours, and I asked Dr. Google about them, and Dr. Google said, you're not actually supposed to be able to experience panic attacks for more than about 15-20 minutes at a time because they're really hard on your body. And I was like, well, that's not the case with me. And so I went to a real doctor, and then the real doctor said, oh, you're having rolling panic attacks. So you're having panic attacks that fold into each other. So I'd have one, and then I'd have a second one, and I'd have a third one, I would keep going. And then, I'll admit that my first reaction was weird pride. I was like, wow, I'm so tough. I have outlier panic attacks. I'm beyond the reach of Dr. Google's medicine. It wasn't like the most fun experience. That part hasn't been. But with that said, it's perhaps then felt all the more meaningful to then have the book out in the world and to hear from people. There's been a really interesting thing, especially the first months that this was out in signing lines. I very often would have people come up to me and, small talk is great too, but people would come up to me in signing lines and they would just tell me about their lives, about like very private things. Like people would just be like, I just opened my relationship last year, and it would be great. There were a lot of people coming up to me and saying like, I'm queer and nobody knows. If my family found out, they'd disown me. And it felt and feels very meaningful to be in touch with people in this way. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking a lot about bodies and like female artists. Did you grapple with like the female-male gaze in your work at all?
Yeah. So the question is, did I grapple with the female-male gaze in my work at all? So I didn't do this on purpose, but at some point I realized, and Jin and Lydia, they end up talking about this a bit at some point. I realized that ballet, the art forms I was focusing on, ballet and photo, are two art forms that are at a far end of having historically been and in many ways still dominated by men. And one doesn't necessarily think that about ballet because if you think ballet, you think woman in a tutu generally. But most ballets are made by men. Most ballet directors are men. It's still a very male-dominated field. And photos, again, the characters talk a little bit about this, but photos, of course, a large percentage of the best-known photographers have been men, but also the language around photography is so violent in a way that's coded as being what one could consider traditionally male. If you think about it, right, like you shoot a picture, you capture, you seize. Much of the language around it has to do, and if you look at early ads around photos, this is very intentional. The language was made so that it was like, you're gonna shoot this picture, like you were gonna shoot a gun. It was very intentionally made that way. They were ads, so presumably this was more appealing to people. And so that was just really interesting to me. And I think Jin is very interested in her work, in her photos, at some point she talks about not necessarily even trying to exist outside of the male gaze or subvert it or upend it or anything, but actually just trying to exists in a place where it doesn't even happen, where one doesn't have to act against it, but where one can instead be free in a prelapsarian state. But yeah.
I wondered, you talked about your experience writing as a Korean American woman, and I was wondering if you related to either character or you felt, I don't want to say responsibility, but like a relation to advocate for either character as what they're meant to represent. Like, do you see yourself, or how does, I guess, your development go into the book?
Okay, so the question is around being Korean American and writing characters who are Korean American, and do I feel what pressures I might feel around representing Korean people. And I on the one hand, there are and have been those terrors that I do feel very much around especially depicting Asian and Korean, in particular, women and people who present as women, for the reasons that I mentioned in the intro. It's also true, to be honest, that I'm afraid pretty much every single day of bringing shame down upon all Koreans. There's just like a fear that I live with. But it's like first my family, but then it extends to all Koreans, which is so ridiculous, right? Like, there are so many of us. We're in all kinds of countries. There are so many varieties of Koreans. But I've been curious about this, and I ask over and over. I ask Korean artists, do you also feel this terror that you will bring shame down upon all Koreans? One prominent example was I interviewed people who had worked on Squid Game, including the director for Vanity Fair, and I asked the director, do you feel this pressure about bringing shame down upon all Koreans? He was like, oh, yeah, absolutely, all the time. And it does sound ridiculous, but also the number of times I have heard Koreans, when a Korean does something shameful, just say like, wow, they brought shame down upon us all. It's just like so there is that, but also I think I share with Jin, my narrator, this reluctance to define myself against anything, and so in this case that would be a dominant white literary culture. I want to exist as though I'm free again in this prelapsarian state, as though I don't feel this pressure to make Korean people proud. And yeah, so I guess the short answer is it's complicated. Yeah.
I was wondering how you went about honing such like personal concerns into an active plot, because I find myself with my own work, I become like entirely too insular and like focused on ideas.
Okay, great. So the question is around how to collect these personal things into a novel, into a story, into a plot. And the person who asked said that they tend to focus on ideas in their writing. So let's see. That's a really interesting question. I'm always pleasantly surprised whenever people tell me that they found my writing to be propulsive, suspenseful, etc. Like, I'm delighted, but I'm a little pleasantly surprised because I don't think about plot actively. I don't think about suspense actively, and what I think about instead is desire. And I personally, and this is just me, there are plenty of writers who think very actively about plot. The House of Fiction is very large; it contains infinite rooms. But I personally, and I'm gonna talk about this in the class tomorrow. I personally love to follow desire, and I do that in part because I find that my own experience of life seems to involve having 14 desires inside my body at all times. And I don't know what it is to walk through the world without that. And I have found that following desire in itself supplies a great deal of suspense and supplies a great deal of forward movement. So yeah. But also I wanna say, like, ideas are really interesting too. I love ideas. I don't know that I would ever discourage anyone from following ideas. Yeah. There's okay.
Me?
Person in the front, maybe first, and then you.
So you talk about your loss of faith.
Yeah.
What led to that, and how does that come out in your writing?
Sure. So the question is around the loss of faith. What led to that, and how does that come out in my writing? So again, I was super religious. I was so religious that I walked around with. I went to public school, and you know how they ask you to wrap your books in paper to protect the books. I used to write large Bible quotes on the backs of the books, so that when I held my gigantic books, I would be proselytizing with every step I took. That's how religious I was. And you know, it's such a. When I lost my faith, I also lost. I was so lonely because I also lost, of course, I lost this God that I was obsessed with. I also lost my community. I grew up in an enclave, in a Korean American enclave in LA. It was so Korean where I grew up that, again, at my public school, Korean was offered as an elective, and non-Korean, and this is way before BTS, you know, like this is way before like being Korean became cool all of a sudden, and in American culture, and non-Koreans would take Korean because they wanted to know what the rest of us were saying when we talked shit in Korean, and we did talk shit in Korean, and so. And I don't know I have ideas about it, but there's something about, especially Korean Americans, there are so many of us who are intensely religious, and so given that I was in a Korean American enclave, almost all of my friends were very religious. And then I went to college, because that happened when I was 17, and then I went to college losing the faith. I went to college, and then in college, almost all my new friends had almost no experience of faith, not at the pitch of intensity at which I'd known it. And so my new friends would say things like, you know, eventually I would say like, oh, I used to be so religious I was going to be a pastor. And then my new friends would say, oh, that's weird. Anyway, glad you're free of that. Now you can drink and have sex like the rest of us. And I was like, you know, the thing is, it didn't feel like freedom. It didn't feel like liberation. It felt and continues to feel like the pivotal loss of my life that has divided my life into a before and after, and a loss that has not in any meaningful way abated ever. The intensity stays with me every single day. And so in some ways, I think almost everything I write is about that, and about that loss, and about the loss of an Eden. Because I loved being religious. You know, I knew so much joy when I was religious. I wasn't anxious when I was religious. You know, because I believed in this benevolent, all-powerful God who was interested in every aspect of our lives, and so it was. I knew such joy in Christianity, and then I stopped believing for a variety of reasons. In part, one of the many reasons was I read so much as a kid, of course, and increasingly it became impossible for me to believe that, because of in the kind of Christianity in which I grew up, I was taught to believe that people who did not believe the way I did were condemned to eternal torment, were condemned to hell. And the more I inhabited other people's points of view, the more that became truly impossible for me to believe. And so I think in a lot of ways, I think everything I'm writing is about faith. I think, and about the loss of it, about losing something that I loved so much. And I think in some ways, everything I write continues to be a final way of being with what I lost. Because of course, grief is an obverse of love, right? It's grief is love. Grief is love for what has become, for whatever reason, unavailable. And so, yeah, it still informs everything I write. Yeah.
Yeah. When you were talking about your upbringing and kinds of books that you write, I haven't read your work yet, but the writer Jeanette Winterson came to my mind, and I wondered if she was ever an inspiration for you, and maybe other writers, especially women writers, who inspired you.
Sure. So the question was around the writer Jeanette Winterson, and was she an inspiration, or were there other writers, especially women writers, who have been inspirations? And yeah, I love Jeanette Winterson's work very much. I should reread it. I haven't reread her work intensely, which for me is a gauge of someone being someone who's especially close to my own work. Writers I have on intense reread include Virginia Woolf is a major one for me. As are any number of writers. Currently I'm rereading. Well, they're not women, but currently I'm rereading The Iliad and War and Peace, which are also books I love very much. I'm actually rereading them in part because I love them very much and have reread them any number of times, but also because it's calming a little bit to remind myself that bad shit has happened throughout history, and that bad shit is nothing new. It's just, if you haven't read the Iliad yet, it's almost comically just like, not just, but it's almost comically, there are a lot of litanies of just like people being killed like over and over and over, like somebody lopped off someone's head in this like beautifully described way. Anyway, but let's see, other women. I also really love Teresa Hak-young Cha has been a touchstone writer for me. She, if you're not familiar with her work, she's a Korean writer and artist, and she was her book Dictate came out in 1982, so a long time ago, and it's a formative book for a lot of people, and is amazing and is difficult, and is incredibly rewarding, I think, in along with that difficulty. Yeah.
So, sorry, I can't talk. So you said that you had worked as an editor previously, and I was wondering, how does that work, like in the editing side of things, kind of translate to your own creative process, and like what takeaways you get from that when working on like your own work?
Sure. So the question is around editing and how that has informed my own writing. And let's see. So the editing I've done has to do with the anthology kink and editing people's work. I loved editing, and I found it to be really rewarding, and I learned a lot from it. Well, I'll put it this way. I am really, really invested in tiny details of my prose. And so what I mean by that is, a really good writing day for me is if I put in 3 commas somewhere, and then I take them out, and then I move them around, and then I delete the 3 lines I was working on, and then for hours, and then I delete the whole page. That's a really good writing day for me. When I do that, I think, I have done the work I was put on this earth to do. I moved around some commas, and then I deleted a page. And so when I'm working with an editor, so my editor, she's wonderful. I worked with her on both my novels. There was a draft of the first book, The Incendiaries, when she asked me very reasonably to make a comment in the Word document every single time I did not want to accept a proposed edit of hers. In the end, for what's quite a short novel, maybe 42,000 words, which is quite short, I ended up having over 1,000 comments in that document, explaining why I could not take an edit of hers. There were so many that every time I saved the document, my Mac would go into that little wheel of death, because it would just be like, we can't, this is too much. And I was so anxious about this. I was terrified that my whole contract was going to be canceled because of this. And most of this was an edit round that had to do largely with punctuation. And at some point she said, Reese, I can't sleep because I'm thinking about your semicolons. And I said, I can't sleep because I'm thinking about my semicolons or my semicolons. And then I was asking friends, is my book counter going to be canceled? Am I never going to be able to publish a book? And one friend said, again, very reasonably, you need to pick which hills you're ready to die on. And I said, and I thought about it, and I realized I'm ready to. I want to die for every hill. I'm not. Why would I go to all the trouble of making a hill if I'm not up for dying for it? And so I never made a change that I didn't agree with, and then it turned out to be fine. But I also wrote when I returned that edit round, I wrote a 10-page explanation of not quite explanation, but a 10-page paper essentially, illuminating, I hoped, some of my thinking. I brought in all this backup. I was quoting Cortázar, I was quoting Elizabeth Bishop. I was like, I have my allies, and this is how they think about punctuation, and therefore, this is my take on it anyway. And I think just like the sheer intensity of my response might have helped. Just, it was like, okay, so you really did think about this. But when I edit, it makes me. I am very, very question based, and I'm that way as a teacher too. I don't make a lot of declarations because because I know that when there have been times when I've received edits from very well-meaning people who I love working with, where I'm physically curled up in a fetal position on the floor, and because I'm just like I can't handle this. Anyway, so and I sort of assume, and I tell students this too. I tend to assume that everyone is at least as woundable, and at least as let's see. Well, let me put it this way. One of my grad school teachers once said, it's safe to assume that every single writer is at least as petty as you are, and at least as likely to hold a grudge. That has been actually very good advice. But I turn to the vulnerability, and so when I edit, I move very hard toward like questions and inquiries versus statements of you should do this or here's a line for you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for that. That was magnificent. Thank you, Reese. That was splendid. There were probably more questions out there that I just cut off. The good news is that Kwon will be here tomorrow night as well for a generative workshop, and you can ask them then if you want. Or please keep an eye out for our subsequent readings this semester. Christopher Tillman will be here in late February, and Andrew Mozina will be here in April. And we will be sending notices out about that. For tonight, please visit the table. Reese is going to be signing books on the books and broadsides on the sofa. Please enjoy whatever's left of the catering and stay warm when you're headed out.